Hi, it's Titi here from My Sacred Blood. Welcome or welcome back to the only channel on YouTube that focuses exclusively on truly holistic menstrual care. If you haven't already done it, please go ahead and subscribe. Or if you're watching from the website, consider joining the mailing list by filling out the form below. And of course, share this video with at least one person who you feel will benefit from this content. In this video, I'd like to take a closer look at how stress impacts the menstrual cycle. In particular, I want to look at the main stressors or the main triggers of stress, also how the body responds to those triggers or the hormonal response to stress, and then finally how to balance or how to maintain balance when under pressure or when dealing with stress. When it comes to life in general, there are three rules, or what I like to call the laws of living organisms, that apply to just about any aspect of our lives. And when you understand these rules, everything starts to make sense. We start to understand exactly why we think the way we do, why we act and react the way we do, and ultimately why we feel the way we do. And so those three laws are: number one, all living organisms want to survive. Number two is that all living organisms want to reproduce in order to survive, or in order to maintain the survival of the species. And number three is that survival will almost always, or will pretty much always, outweigh the need to reproduce. And so once you understand that, everything else will fall into place. And once you understand that, you'll understand that that is also the cause of most stress. And then stress, of course, is the number one cause of hormonal disruption. And when it comes to menstruation, it's the cause of things like anovulation or the lack of ovulation, missed periods, late periods, and just a general irregularities in your cycle.
The fact that stress impacts the menstrual cycle is widely accepted. Of the studies done on the subject, most agree that the stress hormone cortisol interferes with the chemical communication between the ovaries and the brain, known as the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. Because the need to survive outweighs the need to reproduce, when a menstruating woman is having a stressful experience, the stress hormone will suppress the reproductive hormones estrogen and progesterone. And of course, depending on what phase of her cycle she's in when the stress occurs, cortisol may suppress other reproductive hormones. For example, the follicle-stimulating hormone may be suppressed during the follicular phase, and the luteinizing hormone during the luteal phase.
So let's take a look at the main stressors, or the main triggers of stress. And that usually involves some sort of change. Even the slightest possibility of change usually is a threat to a living organism. And I mean a threat in that it has to adapt to how it's going to survive, whether it has to adapt to its environment or to its circumstances. That living organism now has to change in one way or another, and that usually is a stressor. So most types of stress will generally fall under four main categories. That is change in general, whether by choice or by force, or whether it's negative or positive. So this can include things like changing a new job, getting married, moving to a new city, and so on. Then there's a disruption, and disruption is a sudden or unexpected, sometimes unwanted change. Disruptions can be things like natural disasters, or things like a pandemic, or even something as simple as someone interrupting you when you're in the middle of completing a project. Then there's uncertainty, and that is the expectation of or the resistance to possible change. This one is pretty straightforward, and it can range anywhere from waiting for a phone call or a simple email, or waiting to see the end of a pandemic. And then finally, there are endings. And whether it's expected or not, this type of change is usually followed by one or all the other triggers. Endings are usually the most difficult types of change because endings usually require new beginnings, or again, more change. And this can be anything from the ending of a television series, or it can be something more serious like divorce or death. No matter what the cause of stress is or what triggers stress, the body will almost always react in one of two ways, or maybe even a mix of both. And that is, the organism will heat up and create new bonds, or it will cool down and bonds will break apart. And when I talk about bonds, I'm talking about more chemical bonds, the bonds that create those hormones or those chemical messages in our body, the messages that control the living organism. An example of this would be when you exercise. This can be a type of stress. It's a welcome stress because it's something that you choose to do, and it is a positive type of stress. But when you do exercise, your body will heat up and it'll create hydrogen bonds, which will in turn create things like endorphins or release endorphins. So that's one way that your body will adapt to stress and will change accordingly, or your hormones will change accordingly. Another example of that on the opposite end would be something like hypothermia. When you're outside and you start to shiver, hydrogen bonds will break down and the body will freeze or cool down, and then you'll respond in that way by shivering or by feeling uncomfortable in some way. And so that's on the opposite end of the heat reaction to stress, or the living organism's reaction or chemical reaction to stress. Now, although you may not always be able to control or even to identify your stress triggers, you can absolutely control and ultimately change the chemistry within your body. So you can control those chemo messages if you are able to at least identify when you are heating up or when you're cooling down. All right, so now let's take a look at how to stay balanced or how to create balance under pressure or when you're dealing with stress. So the first thing that you'll want to do is to identify the trigger. And sometimes you may not be able to do that. So what you'll want to do is at least acknowledge the response to the trigger. Acknowledge that you are under stress or that you are under pressure. Cells will always respond to their environment. So a good way to deal with stress when you're feeling stress is to change your environment. And this can be anything from just taking a shower, jumping in the shower and cooling down or warming up, or it can mean changing your environment by stepping outside, or to move to an entirely different country or city. And finally, you'll always want to be ready for change. A good holistic menstrual care routine always takes into account the main laws of living organisms and also takes into account the stressors or the causes of stress, and then it will always include a stress relief plan. A stress relief plan will include things like productive rest, and that could be reading a book, creating something, or listening to a podcast, journaling, and so on. It may also include exercise or fresh air, getting vitamin D, or an all-in-one where you're getting exercise, fresh air, and vitamin D all at the same time. It will also include things like good food or good nutritional supplements, a lot of music and dancing or movement in general, and a good skincare or self-care routine. And for more on how to create your own holistic menstrual care routine, you can visit the website at mysacredblood.com/shop to download the 4-part series on how to create your own holistic menstrual care routine. That is it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, I'm here every moon day at noon, and that's Eastern time. Until the next one, take care of yourself.